I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 71 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, March 7th, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss its study of adapting infrastructure to face climate change. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format, pursuant to the House Order of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Members can attend in person in the room or remotely using Zoom.
Before we begin, I would like to inform all members that all of the witnesses appearing before us have been tested for sound for the benefit of our interpreters, and they've all passed the sound test. Appearing before us today, we have from the BC Watershed Security Coalition, Corey Toll, co-chair by video conference, Zita Botello, Director, Watersheds BC by video conference, Neil Fletcher, Director of Conservation Stewardship, BC Wildlife Federation by video conference. From Canada's Building Trades Union, we have Michael Gordon, Director, United Association of Journeymen and Apprentices of the Plumbing and Pipe Fitting Industry of the United States and Canada by video conference. Welcome. Rita Ramadi, Government Relations Specialist by video conference. Kevin Lee from the Canadian Home Builders Association, who is the Chief Executive Officer. La Ville de Saint-Ours, nous avons...
From the City of Saint-Ours, we have Sylvain Dupuis, the Mayor. Welcome.
From Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation, we have Joanna Eckham, Managing Director, Climate Resilient Infrastructure. We will begin today with opening remarks, and we will start off with Corey Toll. The floor... Yes.
Address one issue before we go into opening remarks,
you may
Mr.
do so.
Chair. If I can just have the floor to address an urgent committee business related to the study of McKinsey and the Canada Infrastructure Bank. As you're well aware, several members of the committee representing the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc Party have jointly signed a letter asking that the Honourable Bill Morneau be scheduled to appear at the earliest opportunity. I won't go into the contents of the letter, but we did have a motion and a subpoena for Mr. Morneau to appear, and at the last, at his appearance, he was not equipped with the proper headset in order to give testimony. So we are requesting unanimous consent that he be brought back in the spirit of the original motion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. Do we have the unanimous consent of the committee? See no objection? Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. So we'll begin today with Mr. Corey Toll. Mr. Toll, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Oh,
good morning. Hello.
Excuse
bonjour.
Me. Yep, sorry, I think I called you, I think I referred to you as Mr. Corey Toll. It's Miss Corey Toll. I apologize for that. The floor is yours.
No problem. Good morning, bonjour. My name is Corey Tull, and I am the co-chair of the BC Watershed Security Coalition, and we are a nonpartisan coalition that represents 48 organizations and 255,000 British Columbians. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today and to discuss this important topic. I'm joining you today from the China Creek Urban Watershed, which is situated on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish people. And in every corner of our country, healthy watersheds are vital to human health, security, prosperity, and reconciliation. So accompanying me today are two esteemed members of our coalition steering committee. We have Neil Fletcher, Director of Conservation Stewardship at BC Wildlife Federation, who's led teams of over 100 working towards restoring and protecting thousands of hectares of wetlands across BC. And Zita Botello, who's the co-director of the Healthy Watersheds Initiative and the director of the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative. And Zita has been part of leading $42 million of investments, supporting almost 100 projects in communities and First Nations addressing watershed security and capacity development. Each of them can provide valuable insights, impacts, and outcomes based on their work on natural infrastructure restoration and projects in BC during the question and answer. So the topic of this study holds really great significance for our coalition. Excuse me, healthy watersheds serve as natural defenses against the climate crisis, and wetlands act as our natural sponges. They purify water. Our stream banks filter polluted runoff and provide shelter for salmon, and mature forests retain water and then release it when we need it the most. The rivers and lakes of British Columbia are essential to our local economies, forests, wildlife, food crops, cultural heritage, and survival itself. Our watersheds are nature's infrastructure. So, however, due to the cumulative impacts of human activities and climate change, BC's watersheds, and quite frankly, across Canada, our watersheds are increasingly degraded. This degradation has manifested as floods, droughts, fires in precedent-setting ways over the past several years, including just this month, as in British Columbia, the northern part of our province was on fire while the southern part was underwater. Healthy watersheds protect our environment. It mitigates risks imposed by climate change on various economic sectors. Industries such as agriculture, tourism, breweries, pulp and paper, and even oil and gas depend on clean water. Investing in our watersheds and natural infrastructure reduces these risks. The costs associated with the climate crisis will continue to rise unless we take a different approach. And the International Institute for Sustainable Development highlights that natural infrastructure such as forests and wetlands can provide the same services at a lower cost compared to built infrastructure. These natural defenses are not only cheaper to build, but also more cost-effective to maintain. They ultimately appreciate with time. And we've seen this firsthand in British Columbia through the wetlands workforce and through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative. The response and recovery efforts of the devastating atmospheric river flooding in 2021 cost both the federal government and the provincial government billions of dollars. The Canadian Climate Institute reports that every dollar spent on adaptation measures can save $13 to $15, considering both direct and indirect economy-wide benefits. So we witnessed the importance of natural infrastructure during those floods in 2021. And through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, a government funding initiative during COVID, the BC Wildlife Federation, in collaboration with First Nations and Wild Coast Ecological Society, had been working to restore, stabilize, and monitor McKay Creek wetland in North Vancouver. And since at least 2015, following any big rain event that happened, the creek would overflow, water would rise rapidly, and it would spill into neighboring streets and businesses. Excuse me. Within 1 year of removing invasive grasses, recreating natural inflows and outflows from the creek that came back into the wetland, we saw birds return, salmon returned, and water quality improved. And then during the atmospheric rivers in 2021, that restored wetland served as a critical outlet that absorbed much of the excess water that historically would have been spilling over into the streets, and then released it slowly into the nearby creeks once the weather had passed. So we need bold federal leadership and investments in natural infrastructure to address the climate crisis in BC and across Canada. The watershed sector in British Columbia is a major employer and economic driver, generating over 47,000 indirect and direct jobs and contributing $5 billion to GDP through activities like restoration, monitoring, technology, and urban and industrial management. The recent report released by several freshwater and Indigenous leaders across BC has identified a need of $3 billion over the next decade, with an annual requirement of $300 million to reverse watershed degradation, strengthen natural infrastructure, and enhance watershed security in BC. The recent investment by the BC government of $100 million in the co-developed BC Watershed Security Fund with the First Nations Water Table is an important start, but the federal government needs to be at the table investing in order to meet the scale of the need and have long-term impacts on the ground. That support collaborative partnership for better decision-making, create healthy, secure, resilient communities, while being ultimately a proven model that can be applied across the country. Investing in natural infrastructure and watershed security will advance climate mitigation, adaptation, reconciliation, and sustainable economic development. And moreover, it will create vital employment opportunities and economic benefits. So I commend this committee for studying such a critical matter at this time. By prioritizing and making these investments, we can build resilience in our communities and proactively respond to disasters before they happen. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you and answering any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tull. Next, from Canada's Building Trades Union, we have Ms. Ramadi. Ms. Ramadi, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee on the study of adapting infrastructure to face climate change. My name is Rita Ramadi, Canada's Building Trades Union's Government Relations Manager, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Mike Gordon, the Director of Training for UA Canada, the United Association of Journeymen and Apprentices of the Plumbing and Pipe Fitting Industry. CBTU represents 14 international construction unions, including the UA, and represents over 600,000 skilled trades workers from coast to coast to coast. The UA represents approximately 360,000 piping professionals across North America. As witnesses before us have shared, Canada and more over the world are seeing the impacts of climate change, from flooding to wildfires. Our members have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to build and rebuild Canada's infrastructure. While this committee will have heard from other witnesses on the concerning impacts climate change has begun to have on communities and infrastructure, our remarks will focus on long-term solutions to address climate change and mitigate its impacts on infrastructure, as well as the labor requirements to support adapting infrastructure.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you here today. Buildings continue to be one of the largest burdens on our infrastructure through the use of natural resources and energy while impacting our carbon footprint. We need to continue our efforts to adapt and update them to be more efficient. While the government has made investments to support residential retrofits through small grants under the Canada Greener Homes Initiative, we call on the government to increase grants for home retrofits to support deep energy retrofits, as well as supporting large-scale retrofits for industrial and commercial facilities to also be more energy efficient. This could be accomplished by incentivizing the sustainable construction of new buildings and facilitized to minimize Canada's greenhouse footprint. All incentives, however, should recognize Canadian workers that have undergone all processes to become certified here in Canada and to meet or exceed the requirements. Past incentives have inadvertently displaced these qualified tradespeople from participation in such incentives. If we're going to achieve net zero by 2050, we need to have strong energy efficient standards for all new buildings and update existing infrastructure. These incentives must be based on goals supported through sound design, whose expectations can only be verified through commissioning as able to deliver on performance post-installation and or post-construction. This ensures that private and public investments are sound and continue to deliver value for the life of the systems and the buildings that they serve.
As we look to adapt infrastructure, we need to make sure we have the labor force available to undertake massive retrofits, the rebuilding of bridges, roads, and homes, and beyond. Oftentimes, when there is a natural disaster, construction workers will halt their regularly scheduled work to support the immediate needs of the community impacted, as was the case in BC in 2021 when there was massive flooding and mudslides. Workers rediverted to assist with shoring and highway reconstruction to reconnect communities and rail lines. Right now, several of our skilled trades unions are facing labor availability challenges, which may delay the start and completion of projects that will support adaptation and the rebuilding of infrastructure when weather-related incidents occur. For example, one of the largest building trades unions in the country, the laborers, could use over 15,000 workers in Ontario alone to meet demand.
We need to continue programs like the Union Training and Innovation Program that support the training of new entrants into the skilled trades. We also need to improve our immigration system to address when skilled tradespeople pursue an opportunity to practice their craft here in Canada. When potential new Canadians are considered for entry within regulated trades, we need to set up steps to ensure their abilities are in alignment with the local expectations. The government can work with Red Seal and our organizations to pre-assess potential new Canadians and provide them with a roadmap for their success that remains cognizant of their safety and the value for employers and clients. The Red Seal program is best poised to serve mobility challenges for infrastructure development and maintenance here in Canada. It should be leveraged as a focal point to ensure the readiness of our workforce with the following key areas for consideration in regard to expanded opportunity. Number one, a public and searchable national database for Red Seal qualifications. Number two, pan-Canadian mobility of safety certifications. And number three, micro-credential prerequisites when they align with Red Seal trades.
In addition to adapting our buildings, the Canadian government also needs to continue to address climate change long-term and reduce Canada's emissions. We need support for technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage that reduce emissions from traditional sources of energy like fossil fuels. We also need support for alternative sources of energy like small modular reactors and hydrogen. Budget 2023's investment tax credits will support the transition and incentivize industry to adapt. Linking these tax credits to one of the strongest definitions of prevailing wage in Canadian history to union compensation supports good-paying jobs throughout this transition. We need to develop practical solutions that include labor, industry, and communities. On behalf of CBTU's 14 affiliated international unions, including the UA, thank you for this opportunity to present.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramadi and Mr. Gordon. Next, from the Canadian Home Builders Association, we have Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity today. CHBA is the voice of the residential construction industry in Canada, with more than 8,500 member companies from coast to coast. And our industry is responsible for more than 1.5 million jobs, 107 billion in wages, and 211 billion in economic activity. Our members are the builders, developers, renovators, and all the associated trades and services that build and renovate Canada's homes and communities across the country. And we share the concern and desire for more resilient homes and communities, and have been actively engaged on this file for years. With the climate change crisis upon us, we are also challenged with another crisis, housing affordability, and the associated dramatic lack of housing stock in Canada. Coordinated government actions needed to address these simultaneously to make sure that we cover climate change and housing affordability at the same time. The Lytton fire, the Barrie tornado, flooding in many regions of Canada, and the Calgary hailstorm have all been chilling reminders that homes and buildings face challenges with extreme weather events. When we see the damage from extreme weather events like these, it is easy to jump to the conclusion that building codes must be updated immediately. It is common that when crisis occurs, the first thing some people think is that we need to regulate. While regulation can be part of the toolbox, it needs to be thought through carefully, as there are other measures that should come first and that may better address the problem and in less costly fashion. Overregulation can quickly drive up costs when our housing crisis can't afford it. Furthermore, many effective measures to protect homes against extreme climate events are not related to construction of individual housing units, but to things such as natural infrastructure upgrades, as we've heard, community emergency planning, and yard maintenance and landscaping. And houses need to be resistant to the risks relevant to their particular location. We also have 16 million existing housing units in Canada that need to be considered. What we need right now are the right, proven market-based solutions, and we need to ensure that those are affordable, and if not, we need to innovate to find cost-effective solutions. It is also critical that regulation not be rushed with a proper cross-disciplinary analysis. We don't want to create risk through unintended consequences. This is doubly true when it comes to municipalities who should not be implementing a hodgepodge of bylaws on construction and renovation with the best of intentions that can easily lead to unintended problems. To find the right solutions, CHBA has been working with other organizations to produce guidance for Canadians on resilience with respect to their homes. We have helped to develop wildfire-resistant guidelines, worked with CSA and other groups for flooding and wind resistance guidelines, and are continually engaging in the building code process, where all the issues and building science need to come together in a complete house-as-a-system approach. Through these activities, we have learned that there are things that can be done now, but there is also much work we still need to do. As an industry and governments, we need to de-risk and address the gaps in current solutions, such as how to manage risk during the construction process and how to find solutions that are affordable for Canadians, remembering codes and standards apply to affordable and social housing as well. But most importantly, there's much that needs to be done at the infrastructure level first. We know how to make housing more resilient to extreme weather events, but if the infrastructure is not protecting the homes from the significant effects of those first, the measures that can be applied to homes can be meaningless. For example, without forest management, protecting homes from wildfire might be futile. If there's no catch basin, flood protection against using things like backflow valves in basements will have limited effect. Thinking beyond traditional core infrastructure like roads, bridges, public transit, and water systems, we also need to consider the electrical grid and energy system. Resilient and sustainable communities need to be powered by a resilient energy infrastructure. We also need to remove regulatory and technical barriers that currently hinder the installation of solar energy and solar storage solutions, for example, that will enable homes to operate independently. We also need to consider communications infrastructure. This is important for aging in place and for working from home, which are growing trends in Canada that can contribute to sustainable communities. So we have two simultaneous crises: climate change and housing affordability. For housing, we can make a real difference if we take a coordinated action with respect to both at the same time. First and most importantly, we need to adapt municipal infrastructure to protect our homes and communities from the significant effects of extreme climate events. And we need to collect, analyze, and make location-specific climate data available so that we can target resources towards communities facing the most urgent and critical risk. We also need to ensure we bolster our construction for the right risks in the right places and don't regulate in a blanket form in areas that don't warrant the added cost. Second, with regional data and variances embedded in the national guidelines, we need to promote consistent application at the municipal level to streamline resiliency practices and reduce friction and confusion created by inconsistent local rules. This can be done by first focusing resources on voluntary programs that will allow us to de-risk potential solutions, address gaps, increase industry capacity, and build awareness among home buyers and homeowners. In this way, we can promote the implementation of cost-effective solutions at scale, and codes and standards can follow if and as appropriate. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee.
Next, we have Mr. Sylvain Dupuis. Mr. Mayor, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Mr. Chair, members of the Standing Committee, thank you for having me today. Located in the Montérégie region, in the federal riding of Bécancour-Nicolet-Sorel, the town of Saint-Ours covers an area of 58 square kilometers and is home to some 1,782 citizens. Between 1844 and 1849, a dam and locks were built on the Richelieu River, linking Montreal to New York. The Saint-Ours Canal completed the Richelieu Seaway, and Saint-Ours then became an important community for the federal government, which established the Saint-Ours Canal National Historic Site, which was under the responsibility of Parks Canada. My speech today will focus on 3 things: investing in heat island reduction and water management, funding and supporting shoreline protection for individuals and businesses, and supporting the establishment of a road link between Saint-Ours and Saint-Roch-de-Richelieu. In some regions of Canada, temperature increases and changes in precipitation are expected to affect the natural environment by increasing the intensity or frequency of things like floods and landslides. The effects of climate change will also have an impact on the built environment and on communities. Local and regional municipalities are well aware of the challenges they face linked to climate change. This ecological transition requires political, technical, financial, and material support from both provincial and federal governments. Adapting existing infrastructure is necessary in order to minimize sewer backups, overflows that can affect water quality and flooding, because the costs of this can far exceed planned budgets. Our first recommendation would be to invest in green programs for municipalities and enhance subsidies for asset maintenance, promote municipal asset management, and help municipalities cope with climate change. Over the years, the erosion of some stretches of shoreline have led to significant problems. The Quebec Ministry of Transport considers that this could compromise infrastructure and have consequences on user safety, ride comfort, and traffic flow. Over the entire stretch of the Richelieu River, the main factors thought to cause erosion are the speed of the current, wind-generated waves, and especially boat-generated waves, as well as ice movement. In addition to affecting the aquatic environment, shoreline erosion on this river threatens the integrity of highways 133 and 223. In some places, the Quebec Ministry of Transport has already had to stabilize urgently some roadways. In Saint-Ours alone, over the last few years, there have been more than 6 landslides at different sites, including one that affected Highway 133 in December 2021. To counter shoreline erosion, governments need to help coastal residents stabilize the banks and halt the damaging effects on aquatic flora and fauna, as well as the major geomorphological changes to certain waterways. Our recommendation would be to introduce annual financial assistance, an annual assistance fund for coastal owners, and help businesses and individuals prevent disasters by stabilizing those shorelines. Archival photos from the 1850s show that Richelieu has always had ice bridges to reach both banks, which avoids the need to use highways 20 and 30, and it reduces travel in that area from 35 kilometers to 1.2 kilometers. Unfortunately, climate change is having an increasing effect on the freeze and thaw cycle and on water temperatures. And so there are obvious security concerns about those ice routes because the river doesn't freeze anymore. So to deal with this new reality, since 1982, the Ville de Saint-Ours has been calling for a bridge that would allow vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists to cross the river at Darvar Island, which is under the jurisdiction of the federal government, and they would be allowed to do so year-round. This would reduce GHG emissions and enable direct access for a population of over 15,000 citizens. It would also reduce traffic on the highways. The municipalities concerned have supported this idea for a very long time. The MRCs also support the idea. Provincial and federal MPs, provincial members support it, but the federal government hasn't expressed a particular opinion for or against. Because the Richelieu River is under federal jurisdiction and it's very strategic, we recommend that the Government of Canada help cities conduct a feasibility study for this project. Municipalities don't just want to adapt to climate change, they want to be part of the solution. To this end, they need to help reduce GHG emissions by improving public transportation networks, promoting the use of electric cars, and especially making sure that they are properly equipped to minimize the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much, Mayor.
We have from Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation, Ms. Acom. Ms. Acom, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Bonjour, good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. This work is very, very important, so thank you for your work on this. I'm going to cover 3 points, which largely draw from some of the actions which are in this report, which is the advice from the Resilient Natural and Built Infrastructure Committee that supported the National Adaptation Strategy and that I was lucky enough to sit on. So firstly, the development of Canada's National Adaptation Strategy and the allocation of additional funding to adaptation is a very positive step forward. However, climate adaptation is often framed as an environmental issue. So the department that is taking forward the National Adaptation Strategy is Environment and Climate Change Canada. But in reality, the impacts that climate change have are largely financial and health related. For example, considering catastrophic insured losses, we've reached a situation where we have $2 billion in insured losses in a normal year. And that's just what's insured. What is not insured is estimated to be 3 to 4 times this. In terms of health, 619 people lost their lives in the Western Heat Dome in 2021, lives that could have been saved through adaptation, not to mention the mental health and growing anxiety that people feel about climate change. As we speak, Nova Scotia is burning. Our house is literally on fire. It is time that climate adaptation was seen for what it really is, a key financial and health challenge. When we look at the government departments mandated to deliver action on climate adaptation, the urgency to act is not apparent. In total, 15 departments have mandated actions with no coordination or accountability in a centralized manner. It is notable that the Ministry of Finance does not have any explicit actions related to climate adaptation beyond financial disclosures. What has resulted is a severe lack of investment in adaptation on the ground, and the National Risk Profile report recently confirmed that Canada is not prepared for floods or wildfire to come, let alone extreme heat. This adaptation funding gap was underlined in a recent op-ed in the Globe and Mail by Charles Brindamore, the CEO of Intact Financial Corporation, and Blair Feltmate of the Intact Centre. The United States is out-investing Canada in adaptation by some 3 to 4 times per capita, with a return on investment of $3 to $8 just including avoided damages. The economic advantages to the US are clear. The op-ed calls for additional $10 million to the National Disaster and Mitigation Adaptation Fund and $1 billion to the Greener Homes Initiative to help Canada catch up. The good news is that we can achieve multiple objectives through adaptation, making life better and safer. The federal government has already established green infrastructure programs to accelerate emissions reduction, and we can use the same mechanisms to serve dual duty to adapt infrastructure. For example, regarding residential buildings, the Greener Homes Initiative could readily be expanded to include resilience. Indeed, there are several win-win measures for energy efficiency, upgrading, insulation, air tightness, and glazing can really help, but this also helps with extreme heat resilience. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank can play a similar role. They already have a green infrastructure program that looks at investing in energy efficiency upgrades for public buildings, and this program could also be expanded to include flood, wildfire, and heat-resilient measures, as well as investing in natural infrastructure. It just makes no sense to separate different shades of green. Climate adaptation, mitigation, as well as nature-positive solutions should all be dealt with in tandem. Which brings me to my third point, which is mainstreaming natural infrastructure solutions in Canada. How we define infrastructure in Canada has already changed, with leadership being shown by the federal government on both the national and international scale. The National Adaptation Strategy and the forthcoming National Infrastructure Assessment will both address natural infrastructure. Statistics Canada are also preparing our National Natural Capital Accounts, formally recognizing the financial value of services provided to people by nature. The coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework further highlights the need to restore and enhance contributions delivered by natural infrastructure like flood protection, heat control, and carbon storage, and much more. We now need to take natural infrastructure solutions from novel to normal. Key actions to achieve this are reviewing every new infrastructure project through a climate and nature-positive lens, making natural infrastructure the default solution, including for adaptation, with hybrid or grey infrastructure solutions being used when required. Funding mainstreaming of natural asset valuation and management by local governments in Canada, according to the guidance of this report, which is getting nature on the balance sheet, and agreeing with provinces on strategic actions to adaptation and infrastructure planning at the watershed scale and at the regional coastal scale. Nature is our frontline ally to tackle climate change. A shift from grey to green will help make our dollars multitask, achieving climate adaptation, mitigation, and nature-positive solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Acom. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What a great slate of witnesses this morning. Thanks to each and every one of you for your very in-depth testimony. This is refreshing. Thank you. I will start with the CBTU, of course. As a Shadow Minister for Labour, you had my ear on very many fronts. Mr. Gordon, you spoke about qualified incentives. Can you give a couple of examples of what these qualified incentives should look like in the future, what it looks like today and what it needs to look like in the future to overcome these obstacles?
Thank you again for the opportunity to address you. I'll speak to past experience directly and through our membership communicated to us. In the past, there's been, and current incentives have a lot of potential, but there was issues with individuals in associations that became a prerequisite, and if I could call it, these associations acted as gatekeepers to access federal and provincial grant incentives for building retrofits. This became problematic in one context. Without taking a 1-week course that was delivered for profit by these associations, 5-year apprentice trades that include the scope of practice were actually excluded from being able to offer these very same incentives to their clients. So this was a very big problem. I think what we would like to see is that future incentives address that, these retrofits be performed by qualified people. And another layer to that is that these systems that were performed in the news and in various reports and newspapers were shown to be faulty in many instances, and causes a lack of trust from the government to, go down this road of retrofitting with these new technologies, which is, we only get one opportunity to do it right.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. So what I heard you say is remove the gatekeepers. I've heard that before. Ms. Ramadi, you had spoke about natural disasters and having to pick up a workforce from Ontario as an example and get them out to BC for wildfires or floods. Of course, my bill C-241, which is now passed the House of Commons into the Senate, the mobility tax deduction will help get people to these places. But then there was talked about new training models as well. And I'm a big advocate that we need to start our training in the school systems in the early years, because the same child that plays with a Tonka truck in a sandbox at 3 and 4, for some strange reason at 5 and 6 and 7, they're told they need to be doctors or lawyers and, Lord forbid, politicians. or they're nothing. Can you tell me this new training models, is that what you're talking about specifically, or what specifically are you speaking to?
First off, congratulations, Mr. Lewis, on your bill. And what I was referring to is, I think, a bit more of interprovincial mobility as well. So, for example, if you're in northern BC, having to go down to southern BC to help with a disaster, and things like your mobility tax deduction will assist with that. And then when it comes to training, what I was referring to in part of my remarks was about as we're transitioning to sort of net zero, making sure that workers have the skills that they need to be able to continue to do their work and build our buildings with more energy efficient standards, for example, or move from traditional oil and gas jobs to the new sort of industry. And maybe I'll pass it over to Mike, because Mike is a training director, to see if you have anything else to add to that as well.
Thank you, Rita. I can add to that. I would say, for example, let's not take 2 steps backward before we can take a step forward. When we look at hydrogen, that's another form of fuel. We have 57,000 capable and able-bodied people here in Canada that specialize in that type of equipment as far as the fuels industry. To be able to retrain, you just have to adjust to the different characteristics of that fuel, and they would have tens or decades of experience to be able to move forward and carry that experience to provide value.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Thank you, Ms. Ramadi. I appreciate it. I have a lot more questions for you, but I am going to move on. Mr. Lee, regarding the cost of housing, so we know it to be true that 9 out of 10 young adults don't believe they'll ever be able to afford a home here in Canada. And so you had mentioned about unintended risks and consequences. And so as we change and adapt for climate change, specifically for homes, and knowing that the price of a home and the lack of homes is driving up costs, what exactly are those unintended risks, and how do you believe they will directly affect a young adult purchasing a home and starting a family?
Well, the house operates as a system, and so when you make certain changes to it, so for example, an easy one that people would understand, when you tighten a home for air tightness, you need to add ventilation, and you put on heat recovery so that you still have fresh air, but now you have a more energy efficient home. But if you thought, well, I'm just going to tighten my home without adding that, then you create unintended consequences, health issues. And the same holds true for many other things. You know, the example of adding more insulation and air tightness is good for extreme heat, but only if you have air conditioning. And it helps your air conditioner be more efficient, but if you just have a super efficient, what we're seeing with super efficient homes, which we have a Net Zero Energy Council, we've labeled over 1,200 net zero homes in Canada. We're working hard to get this right, but we're finding that super energy efficient homes can also overheat more easily. So you have to adjust, you have to create overhangs, you probably have to put in air conditioning, those types of things. And there are other things that you do to prevent fire. There's issues in Western Canada with what's called attic rain, from one municipality creating a bylaw to stop one thing that resulted in another issue. So you just need to make sure your code changes are really well thought through. You do your cross-disciplinary work so that your house continues to work as intended.
Mr. Lee, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and thank you, Mr. Lee. Next, we'll go to Mr. Chahal. Mr. Chahal, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all the witnesses for joining us this morning. I'm going to start off with Mr. Lee. And Mr. Lee, you talked a lot about housing affordability. You actually mentioned the hailstorm as well in Calgary. That happened in my constituency, and we've seen a number of extreme hail, climate weather events over a 4 or 5 year period. That last one did about close to $1.5 billion in damage and damaged 35,000 homes. You talked about building code specifically. What engagement has the Canadian Home Builders Association had regionally with their provincial counterparts, the Alberta Municipal Affairs, on looking at changing building codes potentially in Hailstorm Alley, in a community like mine that was devastated with extreme damage to hail, roofs being, asphalt roofs being blown off or damaged, notwithstanding the hail? Have you had conversations with your provincial counterparts to look at more resilient roofing opportunities?
Yes, and we're heavily engaged in the national building code process, and our association is, 3 levels: local, provincial and national. Of course, there's a move right now towards harmonization with the National Building Code, which offers opportunities, and the National Building Code does break things down regionally according to different climate zones and the different weather events that can occur. Exactly how you deal with things like the changing climate becomes more of a challenge. Historically, the building code has been based on historical data. Now we need to move towards a building code that is going to deal with the climate of the future. And so there's some ongoing work with respect to that. And then you have to find the right balance of how much do you change the building code while keeping things affordable. And that's a tricky balance because obviously, for example, the insurance industry is seeing losses. That's not good. But by the same token, how much do you want to increase the cost of housing? And so you need the right solutions as part of the reason why we need more innovation. You also have existing homes, right? We've got 16 million existing homes. So how do you find that right balance? So we're heavily engaged with industry players to find the right solutions.
Mr. Lee, the City of Calgary recently was recognized for having a roofing rebate program. They had asked the provincial government for support to make sure those homes could be repaired with resilient roofing. Do you think there should be incentives provided in a region like Southern Alberta, which hail does extreme damage? I think in Fort Collins in Colorado, it mandated resilient roofs. Do you think in that region, building codes should mandate resilient roofs, and that government should also provide incentives to help homeowners to install those building roofs to make sure that housing affordability is still maintained?
Yeah, I do think that the idea of providing incentives where you have regionally specific climate events makes a lot of sense, because that also will help address the existing housing stock, which is so critical. We only add, hopefully we'll add more. We're talking about trying to double housing starts, but on average, we add 200,000 homes a year to the housing stock. We have 16 million existing units in Canada. So finding ways to help it make more affordable for Canadians to adapt to climate change, like your example of how do we help subsidize part of the cost? Because not only do subsidies help people afford it, they also create education that encourage people to go ahead and do something they might not otherwise do, which and then can in turn increase energy efficiency when it's energy efficiency stuff, or prevent losses in the future by making sure when they go to change their roof, they could have just done, regular shingles, but if they do something that's more hail resistant, that's a win-win for everybody.
Thank you. I want to go to Ms. Acom. Ms. Acom, you talked significantly about resiliency and the economic benefits. I want to talk a little bit about data sharing. Is your organization working with provinces and municipalities to share the data you have? I would say troves of data that Intact has on to look at which areas infrastructure expenditures should be focused on whether it's on housing or larger scale infrastructure to prevent extreme damage. And then what conversations have you had on bringing forward opportunities for homeowners so they could save on insurance costs?
So just to clarify, I don't work for Intech Financial Corporation. I work for the Intech Centre on Climate Adaptation, which is the University of Waterloo. So we do not have insurers' data. That's Intech's data. So I know that, examination of insurance data and kind of, mapping that is held privately has gone into the high-risk insurance pool study that's been undertaken by the Public Safety Canada. So I would say that there is definitely, there's 1.5 million homes in high-risk flood areas, for example, which is 10% of the housing stock that we know, and the government has the data already of where to focus on flood resilience, for example. In terms of helping for residents to kind of reduce their claims. The Intech Centre actually has several infographics looking at exactly what people can do to increase their flood resilience, to increase their wildfire resilience, and just released a couple of weeks ago their extreme heat resilience. And those are all freely available online. And we would like the government and municipalities to really disseminate that information to the public.
We have a big
Thank you, Mr. Chahal. Fortunately, time's up for this round, sir. Prochainement, nous avons...
Next, we have Mr. Berthaud Duval. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today for this study on climate change, which is very important. And of course, the study is also about adaptation. I think that's really the most important aspect of it. I'm going to start with Mr. Dupuis from Saint-Ours. Earlier, you talked briefly about the fact that in the past, there had been ice bridges or ice roads in the winter, and today they no longer exist. Could you tell us a little bit more about the day-to-day impact that has? You know, the fact that ordinary citizens don't have access to those roads. Thank you. Well, the biggest impact is just the detours that are caused, because the access to the opposite bank requires about a 30-kilometer detour each way. And in terms of economic development, it has an impact too. A lot of the time, people on one side of the bank might work at Rio Tinto. And so the fact that those ice bridges are no longer available means that it's a lot less attractive to work on the opposite bank. In 2008, the ice bridge was working really well. It was amazing. But 10 years later, we can see that climate change is having a real impact on it. It's not really passable. It's very dangerous. And so that's a real problem for transportation. And there are all kinds of services attached to this as well. We're in a relatively rural area. So if you've got the grocery on one bank, but not on the other, or pharmacy on one bank, but not on the other, it's quite complicated. So each village, sort of became specialized. So with the ships in the summer and the ice road in the winter, we sort of acted like one big community, but now we're cut off from each other. So it would be great if we could have a way to link the different sides of the river. Mr. GP, you said it's only since 2009 or so that you haven't had that passage? Well, in 2009, we already had a problem with the currents in Saint-Ours. We had an ice road in Saint-Denis-sur-Richelieu, the neighboring village, and the Minister of Transport had authorized that for use. But the freeze and thaw cycle really complicates things. Often the thaw happens very, very quickly, like in only three days, and that's when things become really dangerous. So that's why we stopped using that infrastructure. And if I recall, it's been since about 2014, 2015 that there have been no ice bridges whatsoever on that river. So I imagine that this is still, a relatively new situation, and that has economic impacts, as you said. There are people who are on one side of the bank might say, well, I'm going to reconsider my life choices or my work choices. But, there's also this federally owned dam on the Richelieu River that you've mentioned could be useful. What was the response that you've had so far about your proposal to transform that dam into a bridge? Well, in 1982, the Conservative government at the time had talked about that, and the base of the dam had been planned to be, capable of supporting a road. So half of it is basically already built. All we would have to do is finish the project. It would be relatively simple. It wouldn't have an astronomical cost, but it would really facilitate transport and it would help with the infrastructure there. So, there are a million different departments that deal with this. So, infrastructure, transport, fisheries and oceans. So really, I think the federal government needs to take a clear lead on this, because otherwise we end up in this sort of hall of mirrors where we don't know whose door to knock on if we want help with this project. So I think that we need clear leadership from the federal government so that we can move forward with the project. You talked a little bit about ships. You said there's no more ice bridge, but in the summer you might have ships in operation. Are there other alternative solutions that might allow for crossings in the winter, even if there is some ice in the river? Like, could you have some sort of a winter operational ship? Well, yeah, the danger there is the ice, because even if the river isn't fully frozen, you have ice flowing down from Lac Champlain, so that can be quite dangerous for a ship to cross, especially if it's carrying vehicles. There are potential projects that exist, but it's pretty complicated. And, when you're talking about crossing a waterway, there is infrastructure. We would need the political will to get it done. But I think this could be a really great project with all levels of government to work on the dam. So obviously today's study focuses on adapting to climate change and adapting our infrastructure, and also adapting federal programs and policies to help. In your opinion, are there any federal programs that your municipality could benefit from in order to find solutions for this bridge, or for, ships that operate in the winter? Any other projects like that? 15 seconds. So the issue is always the same. You have to figure out where you can go to get access to those subsidies. The municipalities aren't always aware of all of the programs that exist, and that's one of the reasons I'm here today. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Ms. Zerillo. Ms. Zerillo, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to be asking my first questions to Ms. Tull. Wanted to talk a little bit about modernizing the way that we do infrastructure, and it was mentioned today, gray to green. So I really wanted to focus on this green. And I know one of the narratives that's long-standing in the infrastructure and housing realms is that it's cost prohibitive to have green or natural infrastructure. So I want to remove that long-standing narrative. I want us to maybe start thinking a bit differently. So Ms. Tull, I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned the idea that, some of these natural infrastructure projects are happening already, that they've been happening in BC and our watersheds. And I wonder if you could share maybe the cost savings that you mentioned, like maybe an example of a project that's been done, what role the NGO played in that, and how that's saving residents and government's money.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I'm going to actually pass this over to my colleagues, as they can speak directly to some examples on the ground of where they've seen this work through investments and saving opportunities. Zita, may I pass it to you?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that I come to you from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, which are the Songhees, Wasanic, and Esquimalt nations. So we, through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative, which funded $27 million worth of work, and the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative has funded $15 million worth of projects, we've seen investments in what I'll refer to as sort of low-tech restoration work, where the activities were not massive infrastructure where you're seeing investments of multi-millions of dollars, where we saw community organizations and local governments working together to restore riparian areas, wetlands. Corey mentioned the McKay Creek in North Vancouver. We also, so these kinds of techniques literally are about planting willow stakes. We have a project in the Chilako region of northern BC near Nechako in the territory of the Carrier-Sicani, where it was under $1 million of restoration work that has happened to deal with flooding impacts, and also helping to restore salmon habitat, where the costs per square meter were significantly less than any kind of hard infrastructure work that would happen in that region. So it's an example of where it was literally putting stakes in the ground and having the data to be able to do that work. We also saw work in the Peachy Creek Hoogie wetland, where it was the same kind of issue, where a wetland was restored at a significantly lower cost than any natural infrastructure, hard infrastructure would cost. And there needs to be ongoing investments in it in terms of maintenance, but the results were significant in terms of flood attenuation during the epic floods of 2021.
Thank you so much. So just talking about those smaller projects that involve community, that involve municipalities, that also involve Indigenous nations, that's something that's been missing from quite a bit of the research and even some of the reporting federally, is the involvement of Indigenous partners. So I wonder if Ms. Hull, if you would just expand on, you made the comments about bold federal investment in natural infrastructure. If you could just let me know what that meant to you and how we could involve municipalities, Indigenous nations in smaller projects like that.
Absolutely. I mean, what we have seen from the investments that have happened in British Columbia is that partnership is critical. No one government or community can do it alone. And we need to see that partnership between nations, community organizations, provincial and federal governments in order to do this work. And I think the work that has been happening through the BC Wildlife Federation has been exceptional in bringing these communities together to see these impacts on the ground. And Neil, would you speak to some of the work that you folks have been doing?
Sure. Thank you, Corey. My name is Neil Fletcher, Director of Conservation Stewardship, BC Wildlife Federation. I'm calling to you from the Coast Salish Territory, unceded Coast Salish Territory in New Westminster, BC. We've been, in 2021, we hired over 100 people working with 7 other organizations, including Ducks Unlimited, Nature Trust, Nature Conservancy, and a number of other nonprofits, as well as an Indigenous band, Laura Kootenai Band. Through that year, we certainly worked on a lot of different projects, over 200 across the province. And I think maybe just going to the point of collaboration and getting some of this work on, I think maybe one of the salient points is we've been recently involved in a process for planning, watershed planning in the Nicola with both government to government, First Nation to provincial government planning. There's been tremendous impacts on infrastructure in that region from the atmospheric flood events of 2021. And who's taking the leadership right now is a lot of the First Nations that are in the area wanting to listen to groups that are doing the work. There's pipelines going through, there's new highways being punched through. There's a lot of moving parts, but it's the leadership from the First Nations currently that are bringing people together to talk about planning and build the puzzle pieces together. People operate in silos often. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fletcher, and thank you, Ms. Cirillo. Next, we have Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses that are here today. My question is for Mr. Dupuis. I'm concerned that the federal programs are not sufficiently structured for smaller municipalities and rural remote communities to access them. And it appears that there's a lack of accessible funding for communities like mine, and I think like yours also, in the disaster and resiliency funding. For example, it's a $1 million threshold for DMAF to be triggered. And that's an extremely high threshold for a small community like my own in Haldimand, Norfolk, to meet. And if they need some sort of federal funding for adaptation, for example, say for building or for what you described with ice and bridges, et cetera. So could you please comment on that and what you are hearing housing and perhaps some of your experiences as with respect to smaller municipalities and any suggestions that you have on how we could resolve that problem?
Well, for Saint-Ours, which is a small municipality, we've often seen that when we apply for federal programs, we often get a no for various reasons. We've applied to all sorts of programs, under culture, communication, infrastructure, adaptation, and we rarely get a yes. I think that one of the easiest solutions might be to make sure that the budgets fit better with big municipalities and small municipalities, so that at least small municipalities have a shot at getting some of those subsidies. There's never enough funding for everyone, whatever level of government it's coming from. That's just the reality. But it's really hard to just be able to get a yes to be chosen. And often those subsidies are needed to get started on big projects. I have a relatively small population, and so I don't have big sway. But, that's where federal and provincial governments really, really help. That's the funding that allows us to get these things started.
Do you find that you have the resources to be able to sufficiently put in an application that would even put you in the running to potentially get some of this funding? Or do you believe that something needs to change to make it more equitable for smaller municipalities to be able to get to the table to be considered for some of these funds?
In terms of resources, we absolutely do have the resources we need to be able to make those applications for subsidies. I think the issue is finding a way to reserve some money specifically for the municipalities or for the provinces so that we could make sure that there is that equity for smaller jurisdictions. I think you really need to focus on what the needs are. And I think it would be possible to modify some of the programs to make sure that everyone has an equal chance. Because often if we get a no, that can slow us down by 4 or 5 years. And for a small municipality, it could even be 15 years. So, bigger municipalities have a lot more means just inherently. And so it's not a big deal if they wait 2 or 3 years for a subsidy, but the smaller municipalities have to wait longer.
For Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, as you know, we are in a housing crisis, and the cost of housing, rent payments, mortgage payments have doubled, and the affordability, the availability of affordable homes is scarce. All of these things being considered, how does this larger systemic housing problem in Canada affect the issues that we're talking about today when we're talking about the resiliency of housing and infrastructure, when we're talking about making it easier for homeowners to relocate out of a risk area and move after, say, for example, a flood or a fire event?
Yeah, that's the big public policy question of the day, isn't it? I think when it comes to affordability of individual housing units, as we look to this, we've talked a little bit about subsidies. It's going to be really important that when we look at regulatory changes, that we make sure that the regulatory changes are the right ones and that we're not creating gold-plated codes, but codes that make the most sense for the situation. That's going to be really critical. It's also going to be important that so much of this is reliant on public, sort of larger infrastructure, and we need to make sure that it's not going to be just new housing units that bear the cost of these types of changes in communities, and that they're shared across existing communities that are going to benefit as well. So
Thank you.
There are a lot of challenges.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. Next, we have Ms. O'Connell. Ms. O'Connell, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Equine, please correct me. Okay, thank you. I have some questions for you. Actually, in fact, with the organization you're with, the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation, I believe one of your colleagues, Blair Feltmate, if I'm making the connection correctly. There was a Global News article, September 29, 2022, where they were quoted on some of the issues around climate change and adaptation. And part of what was expressed in this article, and it may not be in front of you, so I'm not expecting you to know it verbatim, but essentially it spoke about after Hurricane Fiona, the devastation that was caused. At the time of this article, it talked about at least 3 deaths being equated to that storm. And it talked about, I think, a couple of points. One is that avoiding the climate change and avoiding climate change and the severe storms would be ideal, but that the adaptation and mitigation for dealing with these storms is obviously going to be crucial, and what we're all talking about right now. I find it particularly frustrating because I think that's exactly correct, and the debate we need to be happening when just yesterday in the House, in response to discussing climate change and our mitigation approaches, the Conservatives referred to, a member of the Conservative Party actually referred to a reference about Hurricane Fiona as well as the fires going on as a stupid guilt trip. And I find it really frustrating that when we are talking about the very real impacts of climate change, and you spoke about this in your opening, about not only the costs, the very real costs, but the health, and in some of these cases, the death that is created as a result. So I want to speak in that vein about the very real life impacts and how referring to it as a stupid guilt trip and talking about how to mitigate climate change and then also how to mitigate the infrastructure we need. Can you talk a little bit more about the real costs on the ground when these severe weather events happen?
Yes. So in terms of 2022, we are at $3.1 billion in insured losses for that year, which was the third highest year on record. And since, the last few years, we've been over $2 billion in just what's insured, knowing that people who are in high-risk flood zones actually can't get insurance. So, what is not insured is 3 to 4 times that amount. So the costs are very real. The business case for adaptation is public safety's figures are $3 to $8. So that's just including the kind of avoided damages. When you include additional benefits, it goes to like $13 to $15. And actually, a project that I am familiar with in Percé, where they did a beach nourishment project to reduce coastal flooding and erosion, the benefit cost was 68 to 1. So with adaptation, there is the cost reduction, but a lot of the projects that we're actually putting in place, they're to also achieve additional objectives. And if we actually value all of those benefits, the business case is very, very clear, especially if we're actually valuing the services that nature provides, which we're not doing in a routine manner at the moment. So the business case for adaptation is very clear, and the health impacts, I mean, when we talk about a few people dying, not to be indelicate, but when people die in terms of flooding and wildfire, it's kind of not as much as for extreme heat, 619 people, and that was kind of in good conditions, meaning that there was no power outage. If there's a power outage during an extreme heat event in Canada, thousands of people will die. We saw in France, 30,000 people died in France. So this is what we're looking at in the future, and we really need to adapt with urgency.
Thank you. And I want to speak also, you mentioned the not insured or uninsured. And part of what certainly in my previous municipal life, what we saw sometimes is after one event, extreme weather, even if it wasn't to the extremes that we've seen, like with Hurricane Fiona or the fires that we're seeing right now, but that even smaller events, that then residents or municipalities are then no longer insured for the future. Do you have any kind of data, or are you involved in any of those conversations around, what happens next too for some of these at-risk communities?
20-second response, please.
Sorry.
Pardon, sorry?
20-second response,
20
please.
seconds. So what I'm most familiar with is in Quebec we have a threshold. So if people over the life of the house is a certain threshold that they will get assistance, and after that threshold they will not get assistance. And there's a threshold for rebuilding as well. So we're actually seeing social fabric of communities is diminished after disasters because some houses are obviously not rebuilt, but some houses are left as kind of islands, like in Pointe-Gatineau, for example. There's streaks with just a few houses left.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Connell, and thank you, Ms. Acom. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur
Next, we have Mr. Berceau-Duval. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to this issue of the dam in Saint-Ours, which belongs to Parks Canada. What I understood from what you said is that it wouldn't actually take all that much in terms of investment to be able to make it a functional bridge that would allow for crossing, because the infrastructure that already exists actually was built to allow for traffic. So if I look at the federal programs that exist and that, are targeted for climate change adaptation, there's often a lot of talk about adapting existing infrastructure, tweaking it, or finding other solutions. But in this specific case, we're talking about an ice bridge that can no longer function in the winter. So we're talking about an alternative solution for infrastructure so that we can arrive at the same end. And that's using existing federal infrastructure. So do you think that maybe we just need more flexibility? More flexibility should be built into federal programs? And maybe should we have a generalized policy that would allow for the federal government to adapt some of its programs and infrastructure so that smaller communities can actually benefit from them in new ways? Yeah, I think you're right. The challenge is also getting your foot in the door so that we can get good ideas going. So it does require federal leadership. In 1982, there was political will from the federal government. We just need to get that going again. There's also the support from the MRCs, from the cities, from the provincial government. So yes, I think that we need to find a way to be more open to these projects at the federal level. And you need ambition too. Often some of these programs are too targeted, too restrictive in their criteria, and that can prevent innovative projects from getting going. And that's the problem if you want to move forward with things. How much time do I have? Okay. Well, I'll leave my time. Thank you.
We have Ms. Cirillo. Ms. Cirillo, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to go back to Ms. Tull on the Watershed Security Fund, $100 million for the Watershed Security Fund that got announced in British Columbia. And I note that the Union of BC Indian Chiefs Vice President Chief Don Tom was saying that it would be imperative for the federal government to match at least this investment of $100 million. I'm interested to know if the federal government has come to the table with that money and if there's been conversations about the federal government matching that funding for the Watershed Security Fund, if you know.
Yeah, thank you for the question. No, the federal government has not come to the table yet with investments. I understand that there perhaps may be conversations that have started between government to government, but recognizing that the disasters that we're seeing and the billions of dollars that are being put out by the federal government to react to the disasters that are happening in British Columbia can be dramatically rectified by preemptively investing in these natural defenses. And the Watershed Security Fund would be a critical opportunity for the federal government to not only move forward on some of their financial commitments around the Freshwater Action Plan, but also through infrastructure, agriculture, and advancing UNDRIP and reconciliation. That could happen by partnering with the province to provide the investments on the ground in watersheds that need to happen in order to make our communities more climate resilient.
Thank you. And je voudrais demander...
And I'd like to ask Mr. Dupuis.
Wanted to ask about NGOs that might be operating in your community partners that are helping with natural infrastructure. Do you have any examples from your community of how you partner with NGOs and even nations on resilient infrastructure?
Absolument, évidemment.
Absolutely. So in our region, it's on Indigenous land, and we do have good collaboration with them. The NGOs, a little bit less. We're fairly far from Montreal, so there aren't a ton of NGOs there, but there are community organizations, sort of ground level organizations.
Can you share any of those projects that maybe those communities partners are doing, even if they're small in nature, that are helping with resilient infrastructure?
Au niveau des changements.
In terms of climate change? Well, we have environmental groups that are very active and that raise awareness about things that can be done at the municipal level. We are limited by the provincial and federal governments in terms of what they're limited in terms of what they can do. They always need permission if they want to move forward. So maybe that's something that could be changed to allow them to be more proactive. Often we can move forward more quickly if we do have that flexibility.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for this great discussion today. I wanted to follow up with Ms. Toole about watersheds, and you talked about, of course, the importance of healthy watersheds and natural sponges and the experience in the 2021 BC floods, where they obviously helped with flood mitigation, and then and where I'm from in Ontario, we have conservation authorities that are responsible for watershed management. That was, of course, established in the 70s after floods that happened before my birth, but obviously that was part of the impetus. And I know there are other organizations involved in this space in terms of watersheds and wetlands. I was part of one prior to involvement in politics. So what would you say is the best role for the federal government to insert themselves? Because some of these are, there's other organizations, other levels of government, there's provincially driven stuff, to be complementary and not duplicative.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think one of the huge opportunities that we have in British Columbia right now is to see these proactive investments in the work that's happening to restore our natural infrastructure. As you said, our watersheds ultimately are nature's infrastructure, and they provide the resilience that we need for our communities. And one of the challenges is that we're putting billions of dollars into rebuilding traditional hard infrastructure following devastating disasters, which needs to happen at times. But when we actually look at the health of the watersheds that are surrounding, some of our highways, we're in no better situation than we were before. And what we find is that we can get siloed into how we are funding the work that needs to happen. And this is where we've really seen already some unique opportunities in British Columbia with the investments that have happened in watersheds. And if we can start to make decisions and do the planning at the local regional level that needs to happen, where we can bring the federal, the provincial government, philanthropic and private sector together to be investing in the work that needs to happen proactively, we have a huge opportunity to create more healthy, resilient, and climate safe communities.
Let me switch gears for a moment then to ask Mr. Lee. You talked about the need to de-risk, to pre-plan. Obviously, being nimble at a time when some of these events occur and having to rebuild. But you cautioned against more regulation and to not rush into it. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more about that. So we've got that on record.
Yeah, there is just so much going on right now in the building codes and standards environment, and we have a lot of challenges. We know we need to be more energy efficient. With greenhouse gas emissions, there's talk about not just carbon emissions, but carbon embodied in buildings. And then we have all this climate change adaptation resiliency that we need to adjust to. So it's really important when we look at all of this that we also have this other big challenge of housing affordability, and we pull that all together. consider it all, and find the best ways to address all of this, while also recognizing that maybe some of this shouldn't be regulated yet until we find better ways to build things to be more cost effective. And that a lot of the energy needs to go into research and development and innovation focused around affordability. We have this challenge. We need to get there. But before we regulate, let's do the work to find new technologies and test them out, make sure they work, make sure they're not having other unintended consequences. The challenge right now is that this is all happening one on top of the other, and there are a lot of things happening. We need to do this right away. We need to do this right away, and it is urgent, but it's also critical we get it right and we balance it all. When you rush things through the code system, you miss things, or you can miss things, and that can result in other bigger problems. And we've seen that historically in Canada as well, when we've had major failures because things weren't accounted for in the code.
So I mean, to underscore and maybe just reiterate that that planning process and where has your organization been involved in that, looking to these things that are happening now?
Yeah, so we're heavily engaged in the building code process, standards processes. I think one thing that's missing from all of those processes, and I'll speak to specifically the National Building Code, we don't have affordability as a core objective of the National Building Code. And it needs to be there. It needs to be considered along with everything else at the exact same time. And that would be a big move that would help everyone a great deal, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to say welcome to all of our panelists today, providing some great information, and it's greatly appreciated for this very important study. Ms. Ikem, before I came here this morning, I met with the group, Insurance Brokers Association of Canada. We talked about climate change and how it's impacting, of course, through catastrophes right across the country, from fire to floods to, and of course, the impact on the insurance industry and how they have to react to, to these catastrophes going forward, and the impact on their business as well. So I want to ask you, the Intact Centre has shared its support for the government's guidelines, but has said there is more work to be done to operationalize solutions and move away from management by disaster. Can you please expand on this and share your views on how the federal government can improve in this regard?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think, in many cases, in terms of flood resilience, wildfire resilience, heat resilience, we already have the tools in the toolbox to change things, and it's a question of implementation. So we've been doing a lot of work to provide those tools to residents, to provide them to businesses, so that we get action on the ground. And by accelerating action on the ground, that is how we reduce risks. So we really need, the national adaptation is a great start, but the implementation of the actual actions on the ground is what really counts, and we need to step up how we're investing in both the kind of infrastructural solutions, but also in how we're informing the public about their role in this kind of whole of society approach to adaptation. Private sector also needs to play a role. For example, I know that IBAC, for example, are training. They have a training program in flood resilience so that they can tell their clients what the flood resilient measures they have are. So I think everybody is in this together, but we do need to basically invest in different levels: public, business, private sector, and governments as well.
Thank you very much. I know, for example, in Nova Scotia right now, with the fires impacting, many of the residents in Upper Tantall and Hemmons Plains and so on, including my son and daughter, there's a lot of questions about, operationalizing things and forest management practices, and how we should be probably designing subdivisions with, some attention to future fire possibilities and fire breaks, some kind of fire break mechanisms in place. So that's extremely important. Also, can you explain how large and small or rural communities, I guess you'd call them, face the issues of climate change and addressing their infrastructure needs differently? For example, how can the federal government take this into account and provide more equitable access to funding in the future in terms of how we deal with that?
Yeah, I think many different communities are facing different risks. So there's not a kind of blanket approach that we can apply that will kind of address all communities equally, because some are facing forest fires, some are facing coastal erosion. So there's a kind of, I think we understand what the problems are. In terms of access to funding, I think the funding has been provided to Federation of Canadian Municipalities for adaptation. So I think that could be a key way of assisting municipalities, particularly smaller municipalities, through that mechanism. But similarly, adapting the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund that's already established to make that more accessible, maybe making the application process more simplified so that it is accessible to small, like less resource communities, and also kind of making sure that also addresses the natural infrastructure solutions, which are often less costly and may not be a defined project, but actually a management approach. Like, for example, sustainable management of riparian areas can really help us with flood risk upstream of flooded communities. So, adapting that so that we have all the tools represented in the toolbox.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers.
Are we done?
We are indeed. Oh, yeah, sorry, the clerk has pointed out you have 7 seconds. So.
7 seconds.
Go ahead,
Mr. Lee. In terms of codes you talked about, how does the current coding system apply to new infrastructure versus existing infrastructure?
Well, the building code really applies to buildings, not so much to the infrastructure. So that's more engineering. Yeah.
It was very good use of your 7 seconds, Mr. Rogers. Well done, sir. Next, we have Mr. Dalton. Mr. Dalton, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much to the witnesses for your testimony. It's very interesting. The first question to Mr. Gordon, talking about, again, the regulations and affordability. I was from Vancouver area. The average house in Vancouver the regulations is about $600,000 adding to the cost, which is a lot. I mean, you mentioned you mentioned about the housing envelope, how we're becoming more and more efficient, but that's actually forcing people to go into forced air, climate, into air conditioning. I mean, for the most of our history in that lower mainland, most houses haven't had air conditioning, but now we're being forced into that. So you've touched on this quite a bit, and then also it's interesting because with forced air, it takes energy, so you're actually using more energy. So it seems to be kind of we're trying to reduce consumption, and yet we seem to be not working in tandem, one hand with the other. And so I just want to give you more, just if you can further elaborate on this, and what the cost benefit to what is being done. And I think heavily on the cost, because people are finding it very challenging in many parts, especially our urban centers and lower mainland in Toronto and other places, to be able to afford this place. And so are we really hurting ourselves by what we're doing? It's like, when is there enough?
Well, you definitely need to be careful to not go too far. When it comes to increasing your, what we would call cooling loads, we're going to get into building science now, but, overall, in terms of energy efficiency, you tend to, with these high-performance homes, lower your heating load, which is the main energy consumer over the course of a year. And yes, in some cases, that's resulting in needing cooling when you wouldn't have required otherwise. Overall, your energy savings are better. However, you are creating a cooling load that you might not have needed before. However, with extreme climate events coming, you may be glad you had air conditioning systems anyway. So it's a tricky balance. That said, the bigger question is how fast you go to these next levels. If you're in BC, you have your step code already. We already know the highest level of that code goes well past net zero and is maybe too far. And the cost effectiveness is not there yet. We are building net zero homes for those who can afford it and want to invest that way, but it is not a cost-effective solution yet, which is why we keep harping on the need for more innovation, more R&D. We need to bring the costs of building to that level down so that it does make complete cost-effective sense and becomes affordable for everybody to be able to invest that way.
Didn't mean to address that question to you, Mr. Lee. The next one will be to Mr. Gordon. And we have the community I represent, one of the communities, Pitt Meadows, in the Lower Mainland. We have a very important project that it was an underpass where the main artery going into the city was supposed to have one, and where the CPR rail was going there. And it was intended to be under construction, but it looks like it's going to be pulled because of the cost escalation from about 63 million to now $200 million. And most of that is actually not in the actual construction. It's more in regulation, the ever-changing regulations and management, and so we're seeing all how this really impacts. So I'm just thinking about you, Mr. Gordon, and the trades. If we don't have this, as far as jobs, and what your thoughts are about this. And I believe you by video conference. Is he here?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to respond to you, and I do agree with partial answers from Mr. Lee, just for clarity there, and in answering my previous question. I will respond as follows. There's a few things to unpack with your question. Number one, when we're talking deregulation, we know a lot of things get thrown kind of under that umbrella. And when we look at deregulation, we have to be very careful because we don't know what the problem is with removing stop signs till the stop signs are removed, and they're there for a reason. I would caution the removal of regulations, but I would say that everything that is there for the purpose could be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. When you're looking at a situation, as you've mentioned, when we see deregulation, and that's not my expertise for looking at what the total encompassing thing is for that situation, but I can say for deregulation, it's a short-sighted solution in most instances.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Gordon. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what I want to do here is essentially concentrate on the business of government. How does the federal government be a better partner with our local communities as well as stakeholders to create resiliency through leveraging financing partners, different levels of government, as well as the private sector, that mitigates the financial burden on property taxpayers. For example, the tax rate, Mr. Mayor, that is in fact impacted by operational budgets that finance, for example, capital debt, which I'm sure you deal with every spring. And water bills. How do we mitigate that impact on the property taxpayers? Some examples when it comes to shoreline protection, asset management, asset adaptability, as well as natural infrastructure, maintenance, investments, etc. We have many mechanisms in place, and Joanna, you touched on a few of them. Carbon pricing is one of them. 10% of our carbon pricing goes to municipalities. The other 90% goes back to residents. When you look at the Canada Community Building Fund, as you alluded to earlier, that goes to FCM, the NTCF Fund, the Green Building Fund, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence announcement of $420 million that can and probably will be, once the strategy is put in place, be attached to shoreline protection based on shoreline erosion. Additional funding envelopes that all departments have available to you. So my first question is, would it be advantageous to consolidate these funding envelopes, these programs, under one program that concentrates on climate resiliency, or under the existing programs focus on climate resiliency as a priority under the matrix when those programs are being applied for. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to start off with you.
Ma première idée, elle serait assez.
My first idea would be fairly straightforward. In terms of the big funds, the danger is always that, they're focused on certain things and certain projects get lost. So I think I would want to focus on equity, offering opportunities to everyone, and sometimes just splitting the fund in two, so that half of it focuses on, or part of it focuses on municipalities with 25,000 and more, the other half on 25,000 and less. That would help. You mentioned shoreline erosion in your question. There are federal and provincial regulations, but sometimes the impact on the shorelines is just terrible. Sometimes it's a $50,000 fee just to start doing a study to figure out how we might even start with a project to fix the shoreline. And then when you start considering all of the regulation, it might cost $500,000 to just repair 150 feet of shoreline. No one has the means to do that. So there are a lot of good initiatives about, regulating the speed on the water, for example. We've done that locally. That was a good step. I would go further. I would make, boat waves criminal in order to protect the shorelines.
Mr. Mayor, and I feel for you. I had your job for 14 years, and I know what it feels like every year that when you're going into your budget cycle, dealing with your capital budget, but of course the impact of the capital budget, especially when you're debenturing on your operational budget, and you're trying to accelerate those priorities, and it's hard. So, again, the question, and I'm glad you answered it the way you did, is how can we be that partner through these programs that we're offering you to help mitigate the impact ultimately on the property taxpayer and on their water bills. And that we're trying to do that through the programs, but I think we can do it better in the future, especially as it relates to newer programs that attach themselves, for example, to community improvement plans, again, asset management and things of that nature. My next question to Mr. Lee, with respect to, you mentioned earlier a whole of government approach, that we don't work in silos, that government departments work closer together. So I want to get a bit more granular on that. And how do you envision a whole of government approach to ensure that strategic investments are being made? Strategic investments toward infrastructure resiliency are in fact being made?
I think you really need to set your priorities and then make sure everybody's rowing in the same direction. I'll use the example right now. One of our challenges right now is we don't have enough housing in Canada. Part of what's driving up house prices, right? Good old supply and demand. So we're saying, okay, the government has set a priority to try and build 3.5 million additional houses over the next decade. That is excellent. But the question is, are we doing everything to actually head in that direction? And the fact of the matter is we have all kinds of things that are working against that right now. Cost of construction is going up because a lot, we talked today about all the things that might go into codes. Interest rates have headed the wrong way. We have stress tests. There are all these things that are preventing people from getting into home ownership and are driving up the price together. So I think there's more of a need to work at one thing altogether at the same time and have that objective. You're going to have your silos, you're going to have the different departments, but everybody needs to be working together under that one objective.
It is, Mr. Badaway. I know. It goes quickly. Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, and thank you, Mr. Badaway. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelot.
Next, we have Mr. Barcelot-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'll address my question again to Mr. Dupuis, and I apologize to the other witnesses for not having asked them questions. I just have a lot of questions for Mr. Dupuis, and I didn't want to not get a chance to ask them. Now, you represent a coastal community. You talked about the issue of passing across the river, but also the issue of coastal erosion. And I think erosion is an interesting question because, there's also the issue of flooding in the Richelieu. There's an area in Quebec that really does have very high watermark in the spring. You've talked about landslides as well, affecting houses and roads. There was even a house that was washed into the river a couple of years ago, not too far from where you live. And, you know, in the spring, when the water level is really, really high, the management of those water levels is done by the federal government via the dams. And then there's also the issue of navigation, which is also federal. So at the beginning of the navigation system, that's regulated. Now, you're affected by this. Can you tell us exactly how you're affected and how federal organizations communicate with you to ensure that the decisions that they're making don't actually harm your citizens? It's a good question. So we do have a good relationship with Parks Canada, which manages the locks in Saint-Ours. But, you know, a couple of years ago, we sent an official letter on behalf of 6 different municipalities in the area to slow down the opening of the locks, and they didn't respond. So obviously somebody in Dorval or Ottawa decided that the locks should be opened anyway. And, you know, when you have 6 municipalities coming together and saying, look, the water level is so high, we need to delay the opening of the locks so that we can, you know, control things, that's a problem. Really high water level will touch banks at a level that they're not used to being affected, and that's where you start to see problems. And concerning the high water level and flooding, I imagine that there's some management that has to happen, some coordination with Ottawa. Do you communicate, like, does Ottawa communicate with you and with the municipalities? Often we learn things through a press release. Sometimes we learn things the same day that they happen. Sometimes the ships don't even have the information they need at the beginning of the summer, and they need to very quickly adapt. So I think that it should be possible, you know, in 2023 to have better communication.
Well, next we have Ms. Zerillo. Ms. Zerillo, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to go back to our building trades unions witnesses today and wanted to just ask about knowledge on the ground. So there's been lots of discussion about partners and how we need more of them here in this work. And I was wondering, either Ms. Ramadi or Mr. Gordon, if you could answer about whether or not your organization was consulted as part of Canada's national adaptation strategy.
I'm not aware of Canada's building trades directly being consulted, but I would think that some of our affiliates and local councils as well may have been consulted. Mike?
I too am not aware of any such consultation, but we do speak with the federal government and several related initiatives. So it might be indirectly that we're receiving an opportunity to speak to this.
Okay, great. If there is some formal consultation that happened, if we could get that information to the committee, that would be amazing. Thanks so much. So one of the things that I do learn a lot when I'm on construction sites and when I'm speaking with workers is they often have solutions that are simple and effective, but they don't make their way up to government, and they sometimes don't make their way into strategies and programs. So I guess my question to both of you is, what else would your workers want this committee to know in regards to being part of the solution to greener infrastructure, including housing?
This is a great opportunity to be able to speak to that. I would say specifically that first and foremost that they're not excluded. Past initiatives, I've kind of alluded to it in the previous conversation, that past initiatives have excluded qualified people. And the number one priority here should be that people are doing the work that are qualified to do it. And it provides that extended value. I mean, you know, homeowners expect that when they have this building, whether it's efficient or not, that it's going to work. To the points brought up earlier about the home working as a system, this is inherently within our training across the board, so that we are very, very familiar with how everything interacts. All components interact and be able to collectively deliver on value. So, and on health, to speak on that. But specifically, you know, it's also mentioned to the deregulation aspect that was brought up. BC went through an issue of deregulation and put, putting all things under one umbrella, I don't think would be appropriate, but this comes part and parcel to making sure that they are included. We're 20 years past the time, and now that
Thank you,
BC
Mr.
is
Gordon.
recovering from that original incentive.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon. Next, we have Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to my friends at CBTU. And I'm not sure if it's to Ms. Ramadi or Mr. Gordon. One of you had mentioned earlier on about a national database. Can you expand on that? That sounds very interesting.
Yes, to be able to access tradespeople right now in various provinces, there are provincial databases, but through Red Seal and multiple provinces, multiple jurisdictions across Canada have the same trades that have adopted Red Seal status, which means if I'm a plumber in one province, I can work in any province. Well, utilizing a Red Seal database to be able, whether you're a contractor, a homeowner, a builder, where you're able to verify somebody's credentials would be essential and provide exceptional value to Red Seal to be able to have that as a point of contact.
Okay, thank you. But is that something that you think that the federal government should take on, or is that something that industry would take on, or what's the idea behind that? It's a great idea. I'm just curious.
Yes, it would have to be. The Red Seal folks are our partners in the federal government. They are looking for opportunities to increase value in the uptake of Red Seal for pan-Canadian mobility of our workforce. Having a database like that taken on specifically, to your point, by the federal government would provide that opportunity, and it would carry over to other opportunities also mentioned, such as the mobility of safety qualifications. Right now, if I have a particular WMIS certification in one province and I'm qualified and I go to travel to meet a work requirement to work on a power plant or any infrastructure, I have to repeat the same exact training, even though I'm already qualified, out of pocket.
I understand. Thank you for that. And so you were speaking about the Red Seal program, and I understand it inherently. Our leader Pierre Poilievre is speaking extensively on the Blue Seal program that we would introduce, and that's for doctors and nurses that come in from other countries, get them an answer in 60 days, and allow them to write an aptitude test, so to speak, and go province to province to province. And so I'm wondering, because you did mention new Canadians earlier on, and I'm wondering if this Blue Seal program, if you think that would be beneficial for new Canadians to get these folks very quick answers, so they also could go across in our skilled trade systems to shore up the shortage in labor.
Absolutely. I'm very familiar with the Red Seal, less familiar with the Blue Seal, but if it's in any manner it sounds like direct relation, yes, it would provide high value. For new Canadians specifically, you mentioned let's set them up for success and get somebody. We've oriented people from Africa and Australia to come here, and the training in Africa might be 1 week for a plumber, whereas in Australia it's equivalent to Canadians here. So it would be an easier transition. To bring somebody in from a country with 1 week training is certainly setting them up for failure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon. Ms. Acom, to you, and I don't expect you to be a professional in what I'm about to ask you, but I am leading to somewhere. So I'm going to talk about ZEV mandates, so zero emission vehicle mandates. Okay, and so Canada has a target of 60% ZEVs by 2030. The United States has a target of 67% by 2032. The U.S. EPA, generally speaking, Canada follows the U.S. EPA. Now, because these two don't align, it's very, very difficult for the manufacturers, right? So, about 82% of all vehicles and parts that manufactured in Canada are shipped to the United States, okay? So I would think that we would want to very much align with the United States. The reason I'm asking you this question is you spoke about coordination. And would you suggest that not only coordination within Canada, but from a climate aspect, we need to be coordinating very, very closely with the United States as well?
Thanks for the question on coordination. So I think coordination is very key, and I think the model that we're talking about adaptation, and my kind of expertise is in climate adaptation rather than mitigation. But I would say something like we have FEMA in the US that coordinates resiliency. So having a chief resiliency officer for Canada who would help oversee the whole of resilience across government, I think that would be a really good idea.
Thank you so much, Ms. Acom. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Et prochainement et finalement pour...
And lastly, today we have Mr. Yakino. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being there today. Mr. Dupuis, could you tell us about the Richard Gosselin de Saint-Ours skating rink? This is in a small municipality, as you said, and it was funded through the Investing in Canadian Infrastructure program. And could you tell us how the repairs to that skating rink made it safer for your community? Yes, you're right. This was a very nice tripartite project with the federal and provincial governments. We are a small community, and we chose a multifunctional building. We're still using it. And so it allows us to have a covered skating rink that can be used by the community 365 days a year. So it's used as a skating rink in the winter and as a multi-purpose space in the summer. But earlier, when you were answering questions from my colleagues across the way, you said that it was very difficult to get funding from the federal government and that small municipalities are always left by the wayside. But as you just said, you did receive funding for this project. You also said that in your experience, getting funding through the infrastructure program was very difficult. Yet, I'm sure you're aware of the Community Infrastructure Development Fund. This is formerly the Gas Tax Fund. I'm sure you're aware of that fund. And money is transferred there twice a year. And it can fund projects such as water treatment and other community projects and facilities. Now, the federal government provides those transfers. So would you agree that the federal government is giving these transfers, or would you say that it is still very difficult to get money from the federal government, even though we have an example here of a project that was well funded and more funding is being provided? So what have you done with this funding over the last 2 or 3 years? Well, you're right. This fund is very useful to municipalities, and all municipalities have access to it. We have invested a lot of money in underground infrastructure, such as sewers. But, there's never enough funding for that. Even if we love getting that money, and I'm not trying to criticize the federal government here. That's not at all what I'm doing. I'm just saying that there are growing needs everywhere. As an older municipality, we're always dealing with old infrastructure, old structures. So if you take the example of the sewers, well, there's the aqueduct, there's the sewers, they're very old, and we have to sometimes overhaul that infrastructure. So it takes a lot of money for a small municipality. So you were talking about a road that had been begun by an old government, but it hadn't been finished since then. And yet, in 2015, you received an increasing amount of funding, which you could have used to convert the dam into a bridge, so that you could then say that you have access. But you chose to invest the money elsewhere. So the problem is not that the federal government isn't helping you out by giving you money. It's quite the opposite. The federal government is investing more money. Or we could take the Champlain Bridge in Montreal. Under the previous government, things were always being studied. But since 2015, under the Liberals, the bridge is actually getting built. and we're dismantling the old one. So I think that our government has taken more action than previous governments when it comes to infrastructure. You used the word enormous. You said there are enormous needs. But in the 10 years before we came to power, almost nothing was done. And since we've been in office, we've invested huge amounts in infrastructure. So, you know, the parties opposite criticize us for spending too much. So, you know, in 10 years, which party are you going to say didn't do its job? Look, I'm not criticizing the parties, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and take a look at the infrastructure and talk about the bridge. But, you know, the regardless of the government in power, I think that we should all have the ambition of working on these projects together. What I'm suggesting what I suggested in my speech is that we should sit down together, look at these opportunities, really analyze things, and if we work with the federal, provincial, and municipal governments all together, I'm sure we can come to an agreement. And I'm prepared to take my share of the responsibility. I think that my municipal colleagues do spend some of that money, but you know, we need to sit down together and work on this. Have you spoken to your MP? Maybe you could speak to your MP or your minister who's concerned. Thank you very much, Mr. Iacono, and thank you, Mayor.
Witnesses for being here today in person or joining us virtually online. With that, this meeting is now adjourned.